At this time, I'd like to share with you a text. As I studied with my colleagues at Machon Hartman, the Hartman Institute, this summer, we studied virtually where we would typically be in Jerusalem. We learned from one of our great teachers, Melina Hellner Eshed, who is a scholar of mysticism and the Zohar, and she taught a session, the text for which we're going to look at briefly today, for some insight into the way we can navigate the choppy waters in which we find ourselves at this moment. The session was called Midrashim on Mashber. Mashber, a Hebrew word that has many meanings that are fascinating in a time of crisis in particular, because the word mashber can mean breaking. It can also mean birthing. It can mean ocean breakers. It can mean nourishment. And it can convey a sense of meaning, all of which we find now. We find ourselves in that crisis. We find ourselves in a world that feels like it is breaking apart. And how do we find the birthing that comes from that? Begin with a reading from Emily Dickinson that Melila placed here first. There is strength in proving that it can be borne although it tear. What are the sinews of such cordage except to bear? The ship might be of satin had it not to fight. To walk on seas requires cedar feet. And so now we see the use of the Hebrew root shin bet resh. In this first reading, number 2, v'hashever, there are two things that are befallen you, desolation and destruction, hashever. And further, we see it once again in Isaiah 60, desolation nor destruction, hashever, within your borders, a prayer for something better yet to come. And in the book of Exodus, we see the word shever shin bet resh here as vayishaber. Moses hurled the tablets from his hands and shattered them at the foot of the mountain, shattered them. In modern Hebrew, that breaking, that shattering is conveyed by the Hebrew root shin bet resh. On the next page with reading number 6, we see from Isaiah 32 the other use of the term shin bet resh, shever. Here it's mashber. This is what Hezekiah says. This day is a day of distress and rebuke and disgrace, as when children come to the point of birth, mashber, and there is no strength to deliver them. Rashi, the great commentator on the Hebrew Bible, speaks about this and says, unto the breaking ad mashber, to a hardship that is likened to a woman sitting on the delivery chair, mashber, that does not have the energy to give birth. The baby is stuck. Now, I have to say, that sounds like an exaggeration, and yet it isn't an exaggeration for some of us. Some women, sadly, die in childbirth, even to this day. I myself would have died in childbirth had it not been for the technology and the medicine of our modern age that allowed me to have a C-section after unsuccessful labor. 3 times. And so I understand very viscerally what this means, that sometimes the moment of birth can't happen without help. Next, we have another application of the term mashber in a reading from Yonah, which we will be sharing together on Yom Kippur. Jonah prayed to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, his God, from the belly of the fish. He said, in my trouble, I called to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, and God answered me. From the belly of Sheol I cried out, and you heard my voice. You cast me into the depths, into the heart of the sea. The floods engulfed me. All your breakers and billows swept over me. And here the breakers uses that same Hebrew root, mishberecha. Mishberecha, the breakers which are destructive but also constructive at the same time, because it opens up a new beginning. The same root is used in reading number 9 at the very end from Psalms 42. The deep calls to deep in the roar of your cataracts. All your breakers and billows have swept over me. Now I want to ask you to imagine for yourself for a moment, as you've heard these texts recited, and we think about the Hebrew root shin bet resh, shattering, breaking, destroying, opening, and birthing. Have you had a moment in your life of such utter crisis that it was in the liminal space between being stuck and being born, where a crisis has just felt like utter despair, and yet ultimately you found the way out? Many of us in our lives have had such moments, and some of us have had the unfortunate experience of more than one of those. We all face troubles in our lives. It is part of the human condition. And that is that even in the birthing, there's pain. And even in the birthing, there's danger. And God willing, there will be joy. But we also know that it does not always come. What is the worst thing you've ever experienced, and how did the crisis resolve? Sometimes we just have to live with the crisis and find our healing through our connection with each other. It takes time, it takes patience, it takes perspective, and it takes finding the way together. Because what our texts want us to understand is that we cannot do this without each other and without God's help. Take a look at this reading number 10 from Genesis 42, where the Hebrew root shever actually is translated as corn. How could that be? Well, the commentators tell us that it was so dry in Egypt, the crisis of the drought was so extreme, that in that moment the earth began to open up, and only then was the corn able to grow. In the worst of times, there was food. That's just an extraordinary image, because when we get stuck in those worst of time moments, it can feel like there's no way out, that we, like Jonah in the fish, are just being overcome. But in order to find the moment of repair, the moment of birthing, the moment of growth, the moment of corn, the moment of understanding, we turn to God and we turn to each other. Notice in reading number 11, here we have the same Hebrew root shivru. And it was so when Gidon heard the telling of the dream and the interpretation. Because this same root that represents our pain and our despair, and represents as well our birthing and our new beginnings, is about understanding. So the way we overcome great crisis is to find the moment of discernment. And that time of discernment may take time, but also takes learning. We each play our own part in the creative process that comes through crisis. And we know and we have learned that we need each other so that we may be able to complete that process of discernment. We are living in a very difficult time in far too many ways. It is indeed a moment of crisis, the crisis of a pandemic that has so many people lost, so much suffering, and a crisis of fear for those of us who are isolated from each other, afraid to spread or catch this virus, and a crisis of hate that we are now dealing with through a reckoning over racial injustice, and a crisis brought on by climate change with hurricanes in the south and terrible fires in the west. There is devastation, far too much devastation in our world. It's a breaking, it's a shever, and we don't know where the map is to find our way out sometimes. And yet our tradition tells us that we can find the map. We can find the map through our texts, through our prayers, through the opening of our hearts together. A story from Nachman of Bratslav, number 12. Once a great storm blew up throughout the world. The storm was so powerful that it overturned the whole world, changing the dry land into sea, and the sea into dry land, and the deserts into inhabited places, and vice versa. Even as I read this story from Nachman of Bratslav, at least 2 or more 100 years old, I think, wow, he's talking about us. The storm wind blew through the king's palace, and it picked up and carried off the princess's child. Amidst all the confusion, as the princess saw her child being carried away, she immediately gave chase, and the queen following after her, and the king after the queen, till they were all separated, and none knew where the others had gone. All of us, as I said, had gone to the various places that the king had revealed to us to renew our powers. And by the time that we returned, everyone had disappeared. The hand, that is, in mystical terms, a mysterious map, was also lost. Since then, we have all been dispersed, and none of us have been able to ascend to our various places to renew our powers. For since the whole world had been overturned and confused, and all the continents mixed up, the sea into dry land, and so on, it is now impossible to go up using the previous paths. For now, we would have to go up using new paths, according to the rearranging of the world. This is how we understand Shin Bet Resh, the disorientation that comes with this crisis, with all these crises together, and the rearranging of the world that offers opportunity to us. Now we're going to scoot a bit forward to this, number 16, from the Babylonian Talmud, Yevamot 121a. Rabban Gamliel once said, "Once I was traveling on a boat, and I saw a boat that shattered, and I was grieved over the Torah scholar who was on board." And who was it? Rabbi Akiva. "But when I disembarked onto dry land, he came and sat and deliberated before me about halakha. I said to him, 'My son, who brought you up?' He said to me, 'A plank from the boat that came my way, and to every wave that approached me, I nodded my head.'" Rabbi Akiva once said, "Once I was traveling on a boat, and I saw a certain boat sinking at sea, and I was grieved over the apparent death of the Torah scholar who was on board." And who was it? Rabbi Meir. "But when I disembarked at the province of Cappadocia, he came and sat and deliberated before me about halakha. I said to him, 'My son, who brought you up from the water?' He said to me, 'One wave carried me to another, and that other wave to another, until I reached the shore, and a wave cast me up onto dry land.'" The ocean breakers are represented by the Hebrew word shever, as is the new beginning that is demonstrated by the dry land. Zelda, number 17. Great poet, the early 20th century. I step on the earth as on a living body, like those who jumped ship to stand on the back of a whale because their eyes deceived them. I step on the dust of the earth beneath which the water speaks. Roots speak, metals speak. Their noise deafens my ears, dizzies my heart. The air, too, sways and sings, and in the heights, worlds explode. Only the thought of God is an island in the whirl. May this be a time when the thought of God as an island can help to direct us, offer us the map that Nachman of Bratslav and the mystics imagined, and that map that we seek out and we find together to navigate our way out of one crisis after the next with God's help. And may it be so. Shana Tova.